Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
When my sister got promoted and the group chat started pinging with plans for a celebration that somehow included a cake with her new title written across it and a slideshow our mother said she had thrown together, even though it had clearly taken weeks, my parents called me separately and, in the same even tone they use when they want me to comply without arguing, said that they were proud of both their daughters, but that this night was for Rachel and that I should try not to make it about me. Which I took the way I always take it, like a nudge to shrink a little more so the room can stay comfortable for the people who have always had the light pointed at them. I told them I understood, because of course I did, because I have spent years smoothing edges and swallowing comments and letting conversations move past my work as if it were a hobby or a phase. While my sister's milestones are treated like public holidays that everyone is expected to attend, and I promised myself I would. Show up, be cordial, and sit on my hands if I felt the urge to correct a story or push back on a comment that rewrites history, since peace is cheaper than conflict until one day it is not. So I walked in with that calm that is really muscle memory at this point, the kind you build after a lifetime of small cuts that never bleed out but never quite heal either, and I kept a smile ready and a short list of neutral things to say. And I watched Rachel do what she has always done, which is take up space with confidence that looks natural because no one has ever asked her to reduce it, while people we know from family events and a few of her colleagues I had never met drifted around and said versions of the same line about how hard she works and how she deserves everything that is coming to her, and I nodded because I do not disagree that she works hard. I only disagree with the idea that one person's work must be celebrated by erasing another person's, and I kept reminding myself of the rule for the night, which was to be quiet and let things land where they land. What no one planned for was the presence of her boss, a woman named Dana who arrived with the kind of composed energy you only learn after leading teams through rough quarters, and who shook my hand like she had been told I mattered. Which threw me for a second, because that is not usually the script people get before they meet me in my family context, and I filed that away without making anything of it, the way you do when you notice a minor inconsistency that could be nothing or could be the hinge for the whole door. My mother started the slideshow and narrated in that proud, gentle way that puts everyone in a good mood. My dad followed with a toast that compared Rachel's drive to his own early years. And there were a few jokes about how she was born sprinting while I was the kid who always wanted to read the manual before playing with the toy, which got a laugh, and I focused on the promise I made to myself, which was to let it go. To let them have the version of our story that feels good to them, because I was not there to win some invisible argument that never ends. But here is what kept tugging at me even as I smiled and clapped and shifted from one foot to the other to give my nerves somewhere to go, a line in my dad's toast about how this promotion came from Rachel's ability to build relationships that pay off, which is not wrong. Except I know something about relationships paying off that no one in that room knows, because in the last year I closed a partnership in my own work that was quiet and clean and not the kind of thing you post about, and it had a downstream effect I did not fully track after the contract was signed, and lately there have been little coincidences, names showing up in each other's orbits, and each time I told myself I was being paranoid or dramatic. Because that is what you learn to call it when your instincts notice a pattern before your brain is ready to see it. I was ready to finish my drink, say congratulations that sounded sincere because parts of it were, and head out before the night turned into karaoke-level nostalgia. When Dana stepped closer to the center and raised a hand the way a person does when they want a room to quiet without making a big deal of it, and she said something like, "Hold on, before we cut the cake there is something I think everyone should hear." And the way she said it was careful, respectful almost, like she knew there was a line to walk between recognizing the person of the hour and acknowledging a piece of the story that had not been told, and I felt my chest go tight in that old familiar way that makes you choose between staying small or standing up straighter. And I still plan to choose small because that was the agreement I made, but then Dana looked around the room and found my eyes and gave this almost imperceptible nod, like she had already decided that whatever she was about to say was not going to leave me standing where I had been placed. So I set my glass down, I folded my hands together to keep them still, and I told myself to breathe and not jump to conclusions, because conclusions have a habit of making fools out of people who need to be right, and I was not trying to be right. I was trying to survive another family event without taking on damage I would carry home like a heavy bag. And then Dana cleared her throat and said the sentence that cracked the whole night open, the sentence that made my parents' warning sound suddenly small and almost funny in its arrogance, because she said that there was context behind this promotion that mattered, and that it involved a piece of work connected to someone in this room, and that before we celebrate, it would be fair to acknowledge it. And the instant she finished that sentence, every head turned, including Rachel's, and I knew before anyone said my name that this was not going to be the night they planned, and I felt the decision I had been holding all evening slide into place, because if the door opened even a little, I was not going to pretend I did not see it. Dana did not drag it out or dress it up. She just said in that steady way leaders use when they need facts to land clean that the promotion was tied to a growth number the division hit in the last quarter, and that the biggest chunk of that growth came from a licensing deal with a mid-market platform in healthcare services, which made a few of the colleagues nod because they knew the headline. But then she added that the only reason that deal moved as fast as it did was because the platform's chief operating officer had already cleared the legal and security hurdles with another partner months earlier, and that partner was a client brought in and negotiated by me, which meant that when Rachel's team approached, the objections were already addressed. The trust was already present, and the decision turned from a hard sell into a short path, and unless I was losing my mind, which I have been told enough times I am imagining things that I always leave room for that possibility, I watched the timelines align in my head and realized that the quiet contract I closed in my corner of the world had set the board for her move without anyone in my family ever knowing it. There was a pattern to the faces that followed which I clocked without trying to, because when you grow up as the designated calm one you get good at reading rooms while pretending you are not, and it went like this. A quick chin lift from my mother as if to say let us not veer off script, a blink from my dad because math he can accept but connections he does not like unless he made them. An exhale from Rachel that sounded like a laugh because she always laughs first when she is buying time, and then a smile that I've seen at every family event since we were kids where she turns a reveal into a party trick and folds it into her narrative like it was always there, and she said how wild that our worlds overlapped, how synergistic, how proud she was that our family operated at this level, and she made a point of touching my arm in that performative way that reads supportive unless you know it is choreography, and a few people clapped because the room wanted to keep the good mood alive. And I nodded because I have learned you can win without pushing your chair back, especially when someone else is tilting the table for you without realizing it. What Dana did next told me everything I needed to know about who she is and what she has been seeing at the office, because she did not let the story slide back into a generic toast. She clarified that the original diligence packet and the data glossary that calmed the platform's legal team were authored by me, and that the email thread where those documents were forwarded included my name and my direct line, which she knew because she had read it herself during the final week when the numbers were tight, and she wanted to understand where the leverage came from, and while she was careful not to turn the celebration into a panel discussion, she did plant a flag that credit matters and that the connective tissue of business often comes from work that does not get a microphone, and in that moment my mother's smile froze the way a picture freezes when the slideshow glitches. And my dad took a slow breath that he thought was private, and Rachel let out that brighter laugh again and said, Of course, everyone knows Megan is brilliant with paperwork and process, which is a sentence that sounds like a compliment until you realize it shrinks your impact to a pile of folders. I kept my mouth shut, not because I was trying to be noble, but because I was running a quick audit in my head of everything that had touched that deal and everything Rachel had claimed about her promotion on the family chat, and the mismatches were not small. Like the way she had described the client lead as her relationship when the thread Dana mentioned showed it came in warm because of mine, and the way she had sold the speed as her team's efficiency when the speed existed because the Hurdles were already gone, and I felt that quiet internal click that happens when your story stops wobbling and you suddenly stand flat on the ground instead of trying to balance on someone else's version of you. And I looked at Rachel and saw that she had no idea how many receipts exist in the world now, how many BCCs and forwarded notes and timestamped files can be pulled into daylight without raising your voice. And I understood in one clean line that she had built a part of her momentum on a foundation I poured without asking for credit, and that she had gotten used to it because no one ever made her pay for the habit. The room started to buzz with those side conversations that pretend to be about appetizers when they are really about power, and I could feel that familiar reflex rise in me, the one that says smooth this over for your parents so the drive home is quiet. But then I watched Dana glance at a colleague from finance, and the colleague gave a small nod that did not look like theater, and I decided there was no reason to run interference for anyone. Not tonight, not after being told to stay small. And when my dad half raised his glass to move the party back to safe ground, I stepped closer to Rachel with a smile that did not show teeth and said that since we were telling the whole story, it might be good to thank the platform's chief operating officer by name for moving so fast after seeing my risk notes. And I said his full name and his wife's name and the city they moved from because I had sat through the calls that got them comfortable months before Rachel's team ever heard the word opportunity. And a silence followed that had nothing to do with awkwardness and everything to do with the sudden awareness in the room that this was not paperwork, this was leverage. Rachel blinked and said she had always intended to thank everyone and that she had a list, which was funny because the slideshow had not included a single reference to any of it. And I let her talk because you learn a lot from the words people reach for when they are scrambling. And then I lifted my glass just enough to make it official and said I would like to propose a quick thank you to the person whose diligence shaved weeks off your sales cycle and unlocked those revenue targets you have been celebrating. And I looked at Dana, not at Rachel, and said I am grateful the work traveled so well, and since recognition should follow the work, I will send over the original packet tonight with my signature on the cover so the attribution is clear in the company archive. And the way the air shifted told me the message hit its mark because it was not a plea, it was a decision. And it left no room for my parents to smooth it away later with a family interpretation. That was the first small move, and it was enough to change the temperature by a few degrees. But the moment that told me I was holding more cards than anyone realized came a minute later when Dana leaned in that low voice people use when they want to be precise, asked if I still had the draft of the data glossary showing the audit trail, the one with the watermark and the revision history, and I said I did, of course I did, and she said good, we should talk on Monday. And while Rachel smiled wider like the conversation was about nothing, I opened my phone under the table and drafted an email to Dana with the packet and the thread already attached and my line about happy to formalize attribution. Then saved it in drafts and let my thumb hover without sending, because timing matters, and because I wanted everyone in that room to feel the pause before the next thing, which they did, and that is where I left it, holding the send button like a quiet fuse and pretending to sip my drink while the cake was cut and the room tried to find its way back to safe. The party kept moving in that uneven way events do after something unscripted has slipped in, with clusters of people resuming conversations, but their eyes shifting toward me more often than before, not in a loud or obvious way, but in those quick glances people think are invisible when they are actually just careful enough to be noticeable if you have spent years scanning for subtle shifts in a room's temperature. Rachel, to her credit, didn't let her smile drop, because she has always understood that as long as she projects the right image, most people will go along with it, but I could see her recalculating, the way her laughs started coming half a second too late, the way her responses to compliments grew slightly more elaborate, as if over-explaining could patch a crack before anyone noticed it had spread. My parents didn't say much in the moment, which was rare, but I recognized the look they shared, the one that means this is going to be a conversation later, which in our family translates to you've disturbed the arrangement. I stayed where I was, talking to a couple of her colleagues who seemed genuinely curious about my work once they realized the overlap wasn't just incidental. It wasn't that I was trying to insert myself into the spotlight. I've had enough experience to know the cost of doing that in my family. But there was a part of me that wanted to see how far the truth could travel if I simply stopped putting my own foot on the brake. When Dana passed by again, she gave me a look that was quick but deliberate, and while we didn't exchange words, the message was clear. This wasn't over, and she had more to say when the timing was right. In that pause, while the cake was being sliced and people shifted toward the buffet table, I started thinking about just how long Rachel had been able to build her career with little shortcuts like this. Not outright theft, but a talent for stepping into an opportunity that someone else's groundwork had made possible, then presenting the result as entirely her own creation. I could trace it back to high school group projects where she somehow ended up delivering the final presentation, university internships where her networking skills put her in front of people I had introduced her to, family friends who suddenly became her mentors after I had done the quiet work of connecting them to the right circles. At the time, I told myself I didn't care, that I was too focused on my own lane to be bothered by her collecting credit like souvenirs. But as I stood there with Dana's words still hanging in the air, I realized that the lane I had stayed in had always been the one without a cheering section, because they were all crowded into hers. I found a moment to step outside under the pretense of taking a call, just to have the space to think without the low hum of conversations pulling at me. Pulling up my email drafts, I reread the message I had queued for Dana. It was short, factual, and impossible to misunderstand. The original packet, the audit trail, the confirmation that the work had originated with me. Sending it now would be satisfying, but it would also lock me into a single outcome, and I wanted more than that. I wanted to understand what Rachel had promised, what she had built her promotion pitch on, and how much of it was tied to things I could verify. That meant holding my position a little longer, letting her feel secure enough to drop details without realizing I was collecting them. When I went back inside, the dynamic had shifted again. Rachel was surrounded by a mix of coworkers and family, telling a story about the last-minute scramble her team had to pull off to get the platform's executives on board. I stood just close enough to hear without looking like I was hovering, and in the space of a few minutes, she named 2 initiatives as part of her strategy that I knew had nothing to do with her. One of them was a compliance protocol I had designed for an entirely different client, and the other was a budget concession that, according to a quick mental check of timelines, had been negotiated weeks before her team even made contact. The arrogance of it wasn't in the claim itself, it was in the confidence that no one listening would know enough to challenge it. That was when I decided that Monday's meeting with Dana wasn't just going to be a friendly acknowledgement of shared credit, it was going to be the start of something much more pointed. If I could tie enough of Rachel's success metrics directly to my work, and if the right people in her company saw it in the right context, the narrative around her promotion could shift in a way that no family toast could undo. I didn't want her job, I didn't even want her title, but I did want her to know that her pattern had an expiration date. And I wanted my parents to watch it happen without being able to frame me as the jealous older sister who couldn't let her sibling have a win. So instead of sending the email that night, I made a list, every project I'd worked on in the last year that could have crossed paths with Rachel's division, every client or partner whose influence might have been felt in her sector, and every piece of documentation I could still access. I kept my tone light for the rest of the evening, laughed when I was supposed to, joined group photos when asked, and let Rachel have her spotlight because I knew it was better to let her believe she had weathered the awkward moment. The thing about people who are used to being celebrated without question is that they don't guard themselves against the possibility of someone else having the receipts. By the time I left the party, my plan was clear. I would confirm the facts quietly, gather the evidence, and deliver it at a moment when Rachel's version of events was still fresh in everyone's mind, not to embarrass her in front of strangers, but to make sure the people whose opinions actually mattered to her would have no choice but to see the cracks in her story. And as I drove home, replaying Dana's nod in my mind, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't dreading the conversation my parents would try to have with me later. In fact, I almost hoped they would bring it up, because I finally had something they couldn't talk me out of. By the next morning, my phone had the predictable family script waiting for me, with my mother asking if I had slept on it and decided to be gracious, and my father suggesting that while Dana's remarks were interesting, It would be better for everyone if I didn't push the topic further because Rachel had earned her moment and anything else would look petty, which was their favorite word for anything that threatened the hierarchy they were comfortable with. So I typed out a polite reply that sounded like me acknowledging their concern and promising to keep things calm, and then I set the phone down, opened my laptop, and did exactly what I had decided to do, which was to stop helping the story hide where the work came from and to do it in a way that could not be spun later into jealousy or drama. Because paper leaves a straighter shadow than memory, and I was done having my side of things stored only in people's heads where it could be rearranged to fit whatever version made dinner easier. I started with the simplest step, which was to send the email in my drafts to Dana, not as a victory lap, but as clean documentation. Attaching the diligence packet with the watermark and the revision history and the short thread showing how the platform's legal team had signed off months earlier, and in the body, I kept the tone steady and professional, thanking her for acknowledging the connective work and asking that the packet be archived with proper attribution since it had now fed into outcomes beyond the original client, and I copied the general counsel address listed on the company site because I wanted the archive step to be institutional and not just a courtesy between two people who happened to get along at a party. Then I did a second thing I knew would make more difference than any speech at a family event, which was to write a brief note to the platform's chief operating officer thanking him for moving quickly when the material crossed his desk and letting him know I was glad the standards we set together sped up a partner deal for a group my sister worked with, no grandstanding, no accusation. Just a line that connected the dots with my name clearly on the line and the tone of a person who is used to doing work that matters and is also used to being quiet about it until the moment not being quiet is the only way to make the truth stick. Because I have learned that people trust what they can see, I went one step further and posted a short, calm update on my professional page, not a speech and not a subtweet. Just a thank you to the platform team for trusting my diligence process earlier this year and a note that it had now supported a downstream partnership in another division, which is the kind of language industry people understand. And I tagged no one except the company because I did not need to name Rachel to make the credit trail visible, and I turned off comments, which I knew would frustrate exactly one person and reassure exactly the people I wanted to reach, because the post was not bait, it was a marker, and markers quietly change how rooms talk when you are not there. Within an hour, Dana wrote back with a crisp thank you and a note that she had already looped in legal to correct the archive and that she wanted to schedule a brief with me and the finance lead on Monday to talk through the mechanics of the quarters lift, and under that she added a line that carried more weight than any toast I have ever heard, which was that my contribution should be reflected wherever performance is being evaluated. A sentence that sounds bureaucratic until you realize it is how budgets are decided and bonuses are justified and reputations harden into fact. While that was moving, my parents predictably tried to pull me into a Sunday brunch to reset the tone, and for once I didn't enter their frame. I told them I had work and that we could talk after Monday. And when my mother said there was nothing to wait for because family comes before work, I said that for once work would go first because it had been put last long enough, and I left it there without heat, which oddly made it land harder than any argument ever has. Then, because part of me still wanted a clean human moment inside all the maneuvering, I sent Rachel a direct message that was simple and impossible to misquote later, telling her I was glad her promotion had come through and that I had sent over the original materials that helped, and that going forward it would be better for us both if our contributions were named accurately when they shaped each other's outcomes. And I said it without accusation or sarcasm, just a line in the sand said like a boundary instead of a threat. She replied, as I knew she would, with a dense paragraph about synergy and teamwork and how her leadership had activated the opportunity and how the party had been about celebrating her growth, not litigating the past. And then a coda asking me not to post about her company without clearing it with her because it could create optics, which made me laugh in my kitchen because I had been careful not to name her or her boss or even her team. And the only reason her optics were at risk was that she had been standing on a foundation she did not own and the lights were finally on. I did not respond to that part. I just said we would talk after Monday and left it because I had no interest in convincing her of a reality the company's archive and the finance report were about to confirm for me. The revenge, if you want to call it that, started landing before lunchtime when Dana's assistant sent a calendar invite that included not just finance and legal, but also the senior vice president who runs the division, with a subject line that was impossible to misinterpret: attribution, diligence trail, performance linkage, and I accepted without commenting while my screen lit with a second notification I did not expect. An email from the industry association that hosts a quarterly breakfast, where Rachel had been angling to speak, asking if I would be willing to join a short panel to discuss practical approaches to accelerating compliance for partnerships. Since a mutual contact had referred me after seeing my update and a few case studies that matched it, and I stared at the email for a long beat knowing exactly which mutual contact had nudged them and exactly how much it would bother Rachel to watch me sit in a seat she assumed would be hers by default. I did one more thing before I closed the laptop, the kind of quiet move that turns ripples into a current, and that was to forward my original packet to my own client with a short note explaining that its methods had now been adopted by another partner in the ecosystem, which strengthens our position and validates the standards we put in place. And my client replied within minutes with a one-line message that said that they would be happy to mention that adoption in their next investor update, which would give the credit trail a public timestamp none of us could take back, and I felt something let go inside me I had been carrying for years. Not anger exactly. More like the basic exhaustion of being asked to make myself smaller to keep other people comfortable, and I realized I was not interested in being comfortable anymore if comfort required pretending I had not done the work. By the end of the day, the situation looked exactly the same to anyone glancing at our family from the outside. A sister promoted and a family proud and a weekend passing like any other, but inside the circles that actually decide what is real. The company archive, the performance meeting, the association booking, the investor update, the shape of the story had shifted by a few degrees, and shifts like that do not announce themselves with confetti. They just keep moving until one day the room is different and people forget it was ever another way, and as I set my phone face down to let the notifications pile up without owning me, I knew the next part would be the one that decided whether this was a blip or a turning point. Because Monday would not just be a meeting, it would be the moment I stopped asking for room and simply took it, and I was ready for the cost. Monday arrived with that charged quiet that sits over a day when you know the conversation is going to decide how people talk about you for a long time, and I walked into the conference call exactly as prepared as I wanted to be. Not with speeches or anger, but with calm documents and clean timelines and a simple principle that even executives respect when they are honest, which is that work earns its name on the page. And if you anchor the name to the work in a way no one can twist later, the rest of the story moves on its own. So when Dana opened by thanking me for joining and the finance lead asked polite, clarifying questions, and the senior vice president sat silent in that way leaders sit when they are measuring what they are about to decide, I did not posture or try to win the room. I just walked them through the audit trail, the dates, the approvals, the handoff language in the emails, and the downstream numbers they had already celebrated, and then I stopped talking and let the quiet do the work for me because silence exposes the shape of things faster than speeches ever do. They did not argue, which mattered more than any compliment they could have offered, and what came next was the kind of tidy correction that seems small in the moment but reshapes everything. With legal confirming that the archive would be amended to attribute the diligence materials to me as their origin, finance confirming that the quarter's performance memo would reflect the source of the acceleration, and the senior vice president adding that any public speaking or external recognition tied to that initiative should include me as the technical voice, which sounded careful and corporate and not dramatic at all. But in our world, those lines are the currency everyone pretends not to count. And then Dana did the thing I had hoped she would do without ever asking for it. She said that if I was open to it, she wanted to formalize an advisory arrangement for the division so that when similar opportunities appeared, the team could call me in directly instead of reverse engineering my work from a distance, which would mean invoices with my name on them and meetings that did not require Rachel to invite me, and I said yes in the same even tone my parents use when they want compliance. And it landed with more satisfaction than any punchline I could have thrown across a family dinner table. After the call, I sent Rachel a brief note saying the meeting had gone well and that going forward attribution and involvement would be handled directly. And I wished her a strong quarter because I am not petty and because the point had never been to burn her job down. The point was to end the habit of climbing on work that did not belong to her, and I left it there. Then I accepted the invitation from the Industry Association to join the panel on accelerating partner compliance, which would now happen the same week. Her company planned an internal town hall to spotlight the promotion pipeline. And I did not tell a single person in my family, because the older I get, the more I understand that the loudest victories are the ones you never have to narrate yourself. The fallout at home started the moment my mother called to say she had heard from Rachel that I had created a situation. And I told her calmly that the only situation was that credit had found its way to the right place, and that if that felt new, it was because we had all gotten used to a different standard. And when my father tried the line about family unity and optics, I said unity is not obedience and optics are just stories people tell to avoid changing anything, and then I said I loved them and would see them next weekend, and I hung up before the old argument could start, because part of taking your seat at the table is refusing to rehearse the script that kept you on the floor. What I did next was the part one had kept quiet even from myself, because it was the cleanest line of revenge I could imagine, and the one that would feel the most like justice rather than punishment. And it started with a call to the platform's chief operating officer, who was gracious and pragmatic and not sentimental at all, and I told him that since our diligence framework had worked so well with their team and now with the new partner, my client and I were opening a narrow window for 2 additional strategic licenses that would include direct access to me for the first quarter to help integrate the process, and I let him know that one of those windows could be reserved for a different division at Rachel's company if they wanted it. Which did 2 things at once. It made my value transparent to the people who actually run their engine, and it moved the next negotiation out of her orbit and into the hands of people who had just seen exactly where the leverage lived, and I did it with a smile in my voice and no heat at all, because the best reversals are the ones that look like efficiency. By midweek, the association confirmed the panel slot and asked for a short case study. Dana's team sent over the advisory paperwork with a sensible rate, and the platform's chief operating officer introduced me to the head of another division who wanted to move fast and did not require Rachel to be in the room. And when Rachel texted to ask if I was planning to attend her town hall, I told her I would be on a panel that morning and that we could catch up later, and she replied with a strained joke about both of us being in demand, and then a longer message about how she hoped I would keep things positive because she did not want cross signals inside the company. And I wrote back that I always keep things accurate, which is not the same as positive. And she sent back a single word that sounded neutral but read cold, which told me she finally understood the game had changed in a way she could not fix with a toast. The town hall happened, the panel happened, and it played out exactly the way you would expect when people who value results hear from the person who actually built the engine that delivered them. And that night, without announcement or drama, the company updated an internal note linking the quarter's growth to the diligence materials authored by me and listing my new advisory contact for related engagements, and the family group chat went quiet in that specific way it goes quiet when my parents do not know how to spin something into a teachable moment about humility, and I made tea and sat at my kitchen table and let the quiet be what it was without trying to fill it, because the win was not that I had embarrassed anyone. The win was that a habit died and the ground under my feet finally felt like mine. There are pieces that will never be tidy, and I am not pretending this solved all of it, because people do not change a lifetime of patterns in a single week, and my parents will always wish I had stayed small, because small is easier to seat at family holidays. And Rachel will probably find a way to tell a version of this that makes her look like the visionary who brought her brilliant sister into the fold, but the part that cannot be undone is now written in places that do not care about family narratives, and the ripple from that will keep moving without me picking it up and shaking it at anyone, and that is the ending I wanted. Not fireworks, not a speech, just a quiet turning of the table that leaves everyone eating from a new side. And if you are wondering whether I think I went too far, I will tell you the truth. I think I finally went far enough, And the proof is that I did not have to raise my voice to be heard.